This lecture is on the forensic science in the criminal justice system. We're going to be doing a lot of vocab on this. And then, like, what constitutes each one of the different types of, or the individual things, and how can they be used to help track or trace the criminal. Again, you should have the paper notes if you want them, or feel free to write them on any paper you want. So again, forensic science is the application of science to criminal and civil systems. There's a lot of different types of evidence, and they can fall into the different, some of them maybe trace evidence that is circumstantial, or trace evidence that's associative. So trace evidence simply means the small items. Anything that you're going to get off the body, left at the crime scene, left in the person's car. Direct evidence stands on its own and proves the alleged fact. My fingerprints are on the knife that was found in the murder victim. That is very direct evidence. Circumstantial evidence. It only incriminates the person. So the fact that my fingerprints was on a desk in this room proves that I was in this room. Even if there's a dead person on the floor with a knife in it, it doesn't prove that I did it. It just says that I was in the same room as the murder victim. Associative, I would say, is a little more direct than circumstantial because it doesn't give a actual proof, where an associative evidence says this is pretty linked together. Other words that you're going to see, maybe you've heard of some of them, exculpatory evidence. So this proves that the individual is not guilty of the crime. Person was in the restaurant with two other people and the waiter remembers them. Corpus delicti, that is the body of the crime, and this is going to be used in like court. So in the case of someone that's gone missing, if we can't prove that the person's dead, that's kind of right where that corpus delicti is. On the other hand, if you have the person hasn't used their credit cards since that date, and there was blood found in the garage, well, in that case, you are establishing the body of the crime. So it doesn't mean that you must have the body, but you have to be able to say that there's enough information there that there has definitely been a crime. And then prima facie evidence means that there's enough evidence to go to trial. So those things are kind of closely related, but you can prove that there's a crime but not yet have enough evidence to go to trial. So that's how they differ. Can evidence fall in more one category? Absolutely. Okay. Physical evidence. Physical evidence is any material that is not bodily fluid or tissue. Yes, we have physical, you're thinking that is physical, I can touch it, but in this case we're talking about evidence that is not the biological evidence. So specific evidence: fingerprints, footprints, shoe prints, tire impressions, tool marks, bullets, anything that is not part of your biological fluids, tissues. And then we're going to define biological evidence as those things that are bodily fluids: sweat, blood, semen, mucus, tissues, like hair or brain matter left behind. What is evidence used for? This seems pretty obvious to me, but it's going to give leads in that specific case. It can tie one crime to another crime, as you did in the serial killing research. It can help corroborate statements from the witness or the victims. Not all victims are dead. And then any element of the crime. This goes back to our last notes where we were talking about Locard's exchange principle. anything that's left behind is going to help connect us to the crime, or anything that the criminal manages to take with them is going to help connect to the crime. It's the elements of the crime that's going to help connect things. So you kind of have to know, what is a crime? Was it a burglary? Was it a murder? So kidnapping. So besides knowing what type of evidence to search for, we have to know where it's most likely to be found. So we have different types of evidence, such as the class characteristics. So when you're looking for trace, or you're picking something up, you have to know, where does it go? Is it a hair? Is it a fiber? I may have to look under a microscope to tell a hair from a fiber. Is it dried blood? Is it new blood? Is it a bullet? If I'm out in the woods, is that bullet new or is it old? So first of all, I have to decide, where does this fall? Is it hair, fiber, ballistics, blood, whatever? Then individually, that hair is going to tell me, is it human hair? Is it rabbit fur? Is it dog fur? Whatever else is going to tell me, is it dyed? There's many things that you can tell from the individual thing once you've identified it. Once you know that it is hair or fur, you can then get into further individual things that's going to actually help you connect it together. Okay, hair tells you a whole lot, because it's going to tell you if it's an animal or a human. It can tell you what the race or ancestry of that person is. The body, did it come off the hair? Is it a pubic hair? How did it get removed? Was it yanked out during a fight? Was it cut? Someone's running away and they cut their hair and threw it in the trash can. Was it burned? Did it fall out naturally? So those types of things. Of course, there's DNA analysis that can be done on the hair. Even if it was cut, you can do a mitochondrial analysis, which will not tell you exactly who, but it will tell you if it's in the same family. And you can also use the hair to detect how long someone has been drugged or poisoned, or whether or not they've been on drugs. And so that is so many things that you can tell if someone leaves hair at the crime scene. Okay. More types of biological evidence. You have plants. Anything a plant can leave behind: the seed, the pollen. It can be wood chips or splinters or the whole tree. Entomology is bugs. So insects, larvae, eggs. So identification of the plants or the insects can help you figure out the location. You're not going to see some insects in the desert that you're going to see in the swamp. Same thing with plants. There's some plants that you're never going to find in the swamp and the desert, or even here. There's many locations. You can calculate the time. If the seed or the pollen is, if the plant only blooms at a certain time of the year, or the seeds are put down a certain time of the year. Or with the insects, you know that from the time the blowfly lays the eggs on the corpse, that it takes this many days before the larvae, and then you have the first larvae. You have 3 different parts of the larvae. So knowing that this is specifically one type of fly, and that it has a 3-day hatching period, and then you're going to see the first larvae. All of that's going to help you calculate how long has this body been here. So all of that helps with that. More biological, of course, you have the body itself, which is going to give you how they died, when they died. Trace evidence is going to be on the body, which will then move it back to trace. Sometimes you only have the bones. You find an very old burial ground, and all you have is the bones. That's going to limit whether or not you can find the cause of death. because, if they were only stabbed in soft tissue, or the bullets only went through the soft tissue and there's no bullet left there, they weren't killed there. But it does let you do facial reconstruction. You can identify the bones to look for old injuries. I know that child broke their bone, so I'm looking for a broken bone in the lower leg. Some diseases will leave marks on the bones, even. And then, of course, you can figure out the ancestry of the person. Are they Hispanic? Are they Asian? Are they Caucasian? And once you figure out the ancestry, you can actually get the height pretty well. And age and sex are also fairly easily determined by the bones. Of course, we all know about DNA profiling. Anything that's left behind, there's now touch DNA. So literally, just you can get my DNA by looking at by swiping my keyboard. This associates the victim and or a suspect with each other or the crime scene. Does not mean they did it. Just because a suspect is there at the crime scene doesn't necessarily mean that they did the crime. Blood splatter, that can tell you the direction the person was moving, like they got stabbed and then they ran that way. The velocity that the weapon was going at, it can tell you can indicate the weapon used. Was it a stabbing? Was it a beating? Was it a gunshot wound? It can tell you where the victim and the suspect was standing, or that there was a third person in the room. And it can also determine the number of people that were bleeding. So lots of things can be done by blood splatter, especially if you've watched Dexter, you know all this, right? You can also have just the blood. So the blood can tell you, is it human or is it a specific animal? Someone who goes hunting all the time may have a bloody knife, but it only has deer blood on it. And then the blood types, the ABO blood types aren't used as much anymore because DNA profiling is simply more accurate. Blood typing is most useful in excluding suspects, which would include that's not that person's child because that child is O negative and they are AB negative. Not possible. But usually you go with the DNA profiling because it's like 99.9% this is your child. Body tissues, not only can you do DNA analysis on it, but you can also do toxicology analysis, which will tell you if they've got alcohol in their system, if there's heavy metals like arsenic in their system. You can test for the specific drugs, whether it be marijuana, heroin, whatever. And that can tell you a lot. Where they dose with, someone give them a roofie. All those things can be done by a lot of the different tissues. Speaking of drugs, trace matters. We go to toxicology. You have some weird powder or a tablet you find. Not sure what it is. Toxicology is going to take it and test it. They can also test for other things that are in there. You can cut your marijuana with something else and then test the quality and be like, this is from the same batch. It has the exact same amount of everything. Soil, all different types of soil out there, sand to mud, clay, different amounts of clay and sand and mud in something. And so that can tell you the location of the crime. The person drove through that swamp. It can indicate movement of evidence. They buried the body over here, then they moved it over there. Different soils will affect bodies differently, which is one of the reasons that you might need to know what type of soil it was buried in. That's going to affect how long that body was actually there. Bury someone out in the desert, they can kind of like mummify, versus you bury them here in the Midwest where the soil is fairly acidic. The body decomposes much faster. And of course, if there is a disturbance in the soil, that can indicate that there was something buried there, is something buried there, or that someone moved it. You can test the soil and look for decomposing elements in that soil as well. Fibers, tapes, bags, ropes, a lot of different stuff that's left behind. You can look for the color, the composition, the construction. Is it made out of cotton? Is it made out of hemp? Is it made out of nylon? Trace DNA, because if someone's tied up with it, you're going to rub up against it and leave stuff behind. Maybe it has mold on it from wherever it was stored. Transfer of fibers, whether it be from the victim's hand, body has the fibers on it, versus they found the fibers somewhere on the criminal. It can help find the manufacturer. This was only made between this time and this time, and it is primarily shipped to Maryland. And you can match it to the source. So someone cut off a piece of rope at their house where they tied someone up, and then they moved the person and they left the rope there on the decomposing body. They can look and say, yes, that is the same rope or a similar rope. Sometimes you may not be able to tell exactly, but it gives you more little pieces of evidence to help put the victim and the criminal together. Documents. There's a whole section on handwriting analysis and forgery and counterfeiting, and you can look at the paper, and you can look at the ink they use, and you can look at whether or not they were tracing something. So many different things you can do with the documents. Did someone write something on a paper and on a stack of paper, and you can actually get information from the things that were underneath, even though they took the top paper that had the writing on it. We mentioned fingerprinting evidence and how that is the strongest possible evidence if you can find fingerprints that are good fingerprints. Fire and explosives. If there's a fire, you want to try and look for accelerants. You want to look where the fire started, where the explosive was when it went off. Depending on where the pieces are, you can determine, depending on the piece of the explosive, or if there was a body in the fire and the body was moved. All of these can be found by what's left after the fire or the explosion. Which leads us to firearm and ballistics. A lot of that is looking at the shell casings and doing the test. You must have the gun to do the test shooting and look and see if these are the same bullets. There's databases galore out there that will help you figure out from what's left behind that, is this a 22 that was a soft point? And then there's stuff on how close the gun was when it went off. Was it a contact wound and it was right there when it went off, versus there was so much left that you could tell that the shooter was 6 feet away. It can't possibly be a suicide. They were shot 6 feet away. Kind of related to bullets, because we're looking at microscopic indentations left behind. You have tool mark identification. That can be a lot harder because you have to find the tool and it has to have enough variation to it that you can tell that it's not this one, but it's that one. Glass can tell you a lot of things. You can tell the cause of the breakage, like that one in the picture here. That is a high-speed projectile. A bullet went through that window, versus someone got angry and threw a broom and broke the window that way. Direction of the breakage, was it broken from the inside or the outside? Does it fit? Like, is it a fitting that belongs somewhere? Like maybe a eyeglass lens fell out. And then you can also compare the glass fragments. So if you have a piece of glass at a crime scene, did it come from the windshield? Was it from the side? was it a broken beer bottle? So all of those can be found anytime you have pieces of glass. Paint and paint related products. Again, there's huge databases out there. So if somebody hits your car and you go over the edge of into a ditch, and they can use that paint that was left on your vehicle to say that this was on Nissans that were made between 2008 and 2016. It'll help narrow down who it is. It can also, you can peel off layers and see the different layers on something if from a tool. And then there's also just the analysis. This is paint from a car. This is paint from something else. More physical evidence. People leave oil, grease behind. Maybe it's a lipstick smear. So all of those can be tested for their individual components, and you can rule out things. This lipstick was definitely made by L'Oreal, and it is fire engine red. I don't know. Shoe prints and tire prints and track impressions. All of those are great. Sometimes you can figure out it is definitely someone's shoe because it's got unique characteristics. Same thing with a tire. There's tires wear in certain ways. You can tell that they have all Firestone tires that would fit this type of sedan. So information that can help rule out things or include those people. And I think this is the last thing, chain of evidence. Yes. So the chain of evidence is a tracking record. Sometimes it's called the chain of custody. And it starts at the crime scene with the pictures. I'm sure you've watched enough CSI or whatever where they're like, take pictures, right? Put those little tiny, this is evidence number 1. Notes at the crime scene, which could describe smells. You can still smell the gunshot residue. Well, it happened not that long ago. So everything has to be written down with that piece of evidence. This bullet casing was found 6 inches from the desk, and so-and-so picked it up, and I handed it off to the next person, and the next person. If there's not a complete detailed record that matches all the way along the way, evidence can be thrown out or ruled inadmissible. And there has been times when people have gotten away with things because the chain of evidence got messed up. Someone decided to go eat dinner and their car was in the parking lot, and there is, it was because the chain of evidence doesn't prove that someone couldn't have gotten in there. We have to throw out that evidence. And these are just everything to do with the chain of evidence. You have to discover and recognize that it is evidence. Sometimes it's easy. It's a bullet casing on the floor and there's a dead person with a bullet hole through them. Sometimes it's trace evidence that's much harder to recognize. You have to collect it. You have to record that you collected it. You have to identify it eventually. You have to package it correctly. You have to convey it to the right place. You have to store it correctly. And then when you exhibit in court, it still has to be in the bag. And then eventually, when the case is absolutely and positively closed, you have to dispose of it properly. And that is it for these notes.